This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we're going to discuss the Olympics. We're coming up on the Summer Olympics in Tokyo in 2021. And the Olympics, of course, have a long history, as does international sports competition. And as anyone who is a sports fan, as I am and as many of you are, I know, recognizes sports have a lot of politics attached to them, particularly international sports competition. And today we're going to explore the history of the Olympic movement, the history of international sports competition, at least in the last century or so, and how that history helps us to understand the politics around the current Olympics and the intersection between international sports competition and the politics around democracy and international affairs in our world today. We're joined by two of the most interesting, thoughtful, and distinguished people writing and thinking about these issues, Professors Robert Edelman and David McDonald. Robert Edelman is a professor of Russian history and the history of sport at the University of California, San Diego. And he's written 4 books on a variety of topics in Russian history and sports history. The ones related to sports history, which are well worth looking at, are Serious Fun, A History of Spectator Sports in the USSR, and Spartak Moscow, A History of the People's Team. He's been a consultant for HBO, PBS, ESPN, and CBS on sports history. And he's co-editor of a series on sports and world history, and most recently has co-edited a forthcoming volume on the history of sport in the Cold War. I had the chance to read part of this volume in preparation for our discussion today, and it's filled with fascinating articles on people like East German skater Katarina Witt, and the politics surrounding the Olympics throughout the Cold War. Bob, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here.
Our second guest is an old friend and a distinguished scholar and teacher and university leader, David McDonald. He's the Alice D. Mortensen Petrovich Distinguished Chair in Russian History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of numerous books and articles on Russian history. My favorite, Divided Government and Russian Foreign Policy, 1900 to 1914, a book I still very vividly remember reading when I was a graduate student trying to understand Russian foreign policy. Relevant for our discussion today, David's written a wonderful and insightful article on sport history and the historical profession, actually published in a volume edited by Bob Edelman, published just a few years ago. David, thank you for joining us today.
Good to hear you, Jeremy, and always glad to help.
Nice to have you on, David. Before we turn to our discussion with Bob and David, of course, we have Zachary series scene-setting poem. Zachary, what's the title of your poem today?
They say that sport unites the world.
Well, let's hear about it.
They say that sport unites the world, and so it was. We've watched it twirl. We've met the world in all its warts through its weirdest, strangest sports. 1904, absent cheap transatlantic transportation, a Cuban mailman's roots were his qualification, and nearly indeed would he have been forgotten if his New Orleans dice game had gone rotten. Back in 36, the champions of peace, true diversity, held their competition to prove Hitler's superiority. And beneath the black, white, red, supposedly of peace, we saw our vilest demagogues, all decked out in their wreaths. In 1980, we weren't there, nor Soviets in 84. I guess it could be said about those sportsmen of lore that the world had gone and conquered their sport. No one retrieves the football from the enemy fort. 2016 saw us in Rio de Janeiro, the lavish games on the people's dinero, and Ryan Lochte's scary scrape. Who could forget such a narrow escape? But they say that sport unites the world, and so it was. We've watched it twirl. The century's drama, in truth its greatest farce. O sportsmanship, civility, my arse.
I
Okay, let's go home.
I love the humor, Zachary. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about some of the more absurd and or particularly dangerous moments in Olympic history, and the way in which we seem to idolize the Olympics, but also how ridiculous and terrible some of these events can be.
Right, and the ways they can be misused, right?
Exactly.
So, Bob, let's turn to you on that humorous note, but serious one as well. What is the Olympic movement about? Where does it start? And how do we get to this moment where the Olympics have become this huge commercialized enterprise? Where does this all begin?
Well, it begins in the 19th century. Needless to say, when Baron Coubertin is conceiving this possibility of what he calls reviving the Olympic Games. But in truth, this is a bit of what we call Olympism ideology. And one doesn't see much of this when one goes to or listens to an opening ceremony. The link is always to ancient Greece and the so-called cradle of democracy, which of course itself is, as you know, a contested concept. But what happens is that Coubertin is a French aristocrat. His country loses the Franco-Prussian War. He becomes convinced that that's because young people are not physically fit and they don't do sports. And so here's the real genesis of it. He travels around the world, and one of the first places he goes to is Great Britain. And so really the genesis of the Olympic movement is not really ancient Greece. He doesn't take a trip one day and sit there in Olympia and have this idea flash into his mind. He goes to the rugby school and tours the other so-called public schools of Great Britain, where the young British elites go to. These are secondary institutions of secondary education, and it's there that we see sport emerging, beginning to go from wild, kind of violent activities to things that are rule-bound and also are competitive and are seen as a way of producing young men who will lead the nation and also lead the empire. So that's where public schools, the so-called public schools, emerge, and that's the real basis for Coubertin's inspiration, although it doesn't get mentioned in opening ceremonies. At least it didn't until 2012, when, of course, the games were in Britain and it was mentioned quite specifically. So what happens then is that all of these young gentlemen are amateurs, right? They don't do this for a living. Over time, in the course of the 19th century, we see, especially in the last decades, there's an influx of working people, working men primarily. And I should say that when these sports are created in the public schools, these are all male institutions. That these institutions are then challenged by massive numbers, in the millions, of working men who are primarily interested in soccer and seek to engulf or wind up engulfing the young men from the elite schools. So the response then is a series of federations that emerge in the latter part of the 19th century in various specific sports, rowing, what we call track and field, football, what the world calls football. And Coubertin's intervention is a response to the fact that all of these proletarians are mucking about in the beautiful thing that he sees the British elite having been created. And so the Olympic movement emerges from all these international federations, and what he does is tries to organize them and establish a set of institutions, at least the beginning of a set of institutions, which will evolve into the International Olympic Committee. And of course, that's what we see dealing with it today.
This is a really helpful background, especially understanding, in a sense, the grassroots origins and the ways in which this is a movement that transcends different countries. David, you've written a lot about the rise of nation states and the sort of mobilization of societies for nation-centered power in the early 20th century. How does that overlap with this story?
It happens very quickly. Before I answer that more directly, I'd add to what Bob said that a seminal work that is long since disappeared from the young person's bookshelf is Tom Brown's School Days, which is it's a novel based on the rugby experience, and it's a really essential expression of the ennobling role of sport for young middle class and upper middle class men. But the national element of the Olympics emerges very early on, and really to the consternation of the IOC. National controversies. One that I was just looking around that I see mentioned in the memoirs of a Russian diplomat who was stationed to Sweden in the early 19-teens is the Olympics in Stockholm, where Bob, correct me, but I believe that's Pablo Nurmi's big debut. And there's Nurmi is a Finn, and the Grand Duchy of Finland is a unit in the Russian Empire, as a constituent element of the Russian Empire. And the Finns want to fly a Finnish flag. And this is something that comes to the diplomats and is eventually quashed, but apparently creates a lot of bad feeling. But of course, after World War I, the national element, despite people's wish to try and overcome it, in some ways in the peace conferences, but obviously national self-determination becomes a really important consideration in interwar politics, and it becomes a really vibrant force. But it's something that goes back to the middle of the 19th century, as with Bob's public school boys, is in the aspiring nations of the Habsburg Empire, especially, but even before German unification. The idea of athletics and its association with the expression of a distinctive national spirit is very widespread, whether it's the Vater Jan's gymnastics movements or the young Falcons and their various offshoots in the various nationalities of the Habsburg Empire. The Boy Scouts and Robert Baden-Powell are supposed to instill certain national virtues in their acolytes. So what happens after World War I is simply an exacerbation and a concentration of this sense of national distinctiveness and national achievement that, of course, receives much stronger expression because it's taking place in form of competition. And Zachary's poem referred to the 36 Olympics. That was designed from the outset to be that type of festival. We could point to the World Cup, which is emerging at this time as well, and it becomes how can I put it, sort of a parallel form for the expression of this type of national distinction, and that is for all the participant societies. It's a way of expressing some sort of unity that transcends, if we put aside the roots of amateurism, that people see as transcending the other divisions in society. So it's been a strong element throughout, and as we know, continues to be so.
And Bob, just following on David's really insightful comments, to what extent does this international element survive the experiences of 36 and other moments when the Olympics are so clearly tied up with international competition? I mean, we've all seen the images of Jesse Owens in 36 and the Hitler audience. And then, as you've written about so well, during the Cold War, these issues are clearly attached to competition between the United States and the Soviet Union and different world systems. So to what extent does the international angle and element survive, or is that more the veneer over this?
Well, let's backtrack a tiny bit. I was about to, the baton was really passed very nicely from not so much from me to David, but David picking up on it. Because the next, one of the two, in fact, there are really two fundamental aspects to the International Olympic Committee when it forms is one, that this is an amateur competition. So this is a way to keep people who cannot afford to do the sporting activity on their own out of sport. And secondly, the question of nation. So nation obviously implies politics at some level. And so there is this intention that somehow sport and politics did not mix. And so over time, not instantaneously, the Olympics take on the nation as being their fundamental organizing unit. Once you do that, the cat is out of the bag, or whatever metaphor you want to use, and it becomes politicized. And so that's where we get to the kinds of things that David was talking about today. One distinction I think it's important to make is that the distinction was made by Coubertin and others between German mass exercise and so-called corporate culture and competitive sports, usually ball games, which were what the British kind of saw as their big competition. not competition, contribution to the emergence of sport. And the Olympics are a kind of combination of the two, and a process by which we see sportification of things that were in fact aesthetic activities like figure skating and gymnastics and things like that, which become sportified. And so there's an interesting tension, I think, in Coubertin's straddling of the English model and the German model. And the German model goes back again to the late 19th century, where you had in Germany this obsession with Hellenism, philo-Hellenism, expeditions all over the world and archaeological digs, bringing back things from the so-called then Third World to the so-called First World. And that has its roots in the German part of the story. And basically what Coubertin comes to focus on ancient Greece is to bring the Germans into what he sees as a way of contributing to world peace by having the English and the Germans, who are in an arms race at this point, find a basis for cooperation.
David, just building on these comments on how the Germans and others adopt the Olympics as a way of showcasing their competitive urge and their ability to compete with other societies. Why do the communist countries, in particular the Soviet Union and East Germany, why do they seem to put such inordinate emphasis upon the Olympics, to the point of, and of course this happens in the United States as well, but it seems more extreme, especially in the East German case, the use of doping and the commitment of resources in a very strained budget environment to competition? What relationship, if any, is there between that and the communist regimes themselves?
Again, before I'll build on a point that Bob made, is that if your listeners want to understand how they can see in action the blending of the German and the British attitudes to sport, Bob's right. You look at figure skating, gymnastics, especially rhythmic gymnastics, but the mass gatherings of the athletes before and after the opening and closing ceremonies, and in a lot of countries, most recently Beijing in 1908, those big flashcard displays, right? And the mass choreography, sort of Busby Berkeley meets God knows what. But in terms of the use of sport to emblematize the system, I think we see that first with Nazi Germany and Triumph of the Will, and it's and again the Italian sides in the World Cup, that these are supposed to embody certain national principle. They're supposed to represent a system, an entirely integrated way of producing modernity, and is supposed to be held to be demonstrably superior by its competitive success in the arena, but also the general physical fitness and the physical superiority of their specimen. This is all tied up with eugenics and Miss America pageants and movements like this as well. But it's a very powerful and widespread phenomenon. But on the actual its role in the Soviet and the Soviet style of socialist states, Bob is really your expert, and I'll yield the floor to him.
I accept that, and we'll add nuance in order to perhaps slightly query with you.
Yeah.
Hitler was not a big sports fan.
No, I know. No,
he was interested only in boxing, and he, in fact, was very much uncomfortable with the Olympic movement because it was internationalist. He saw it as similar to the League of Nations, and of course, you know what he did with that.
Yeah.
And so he had to be convinced by Goebbels and others that this was a useful thing. And really, the complexity here is that Goebbels used it as a way to normalize and kind of downplay the racial aspects of this. And this was, of course, a very tricky moment, because here they come to power. They do all these awful things in the 3-year period. They haven't done the final solution yet. So we have to be careful in not conflating all these things together. But then what happens is the Olympics take place. I would argue that Jesse Owens was a kind of exception to the larger rule, as you described it, of German superiority and German fitness. But also they downplayed the anti-Semitism. And you remember there was an attempt to boycott the Olympics in 1936. And so in response to that, and let it be said that the Olympic Committee was very much in favor of defending the Nazis about their approach to the Olympics. But nevertheless, they try to come off as appearing normal. And the reason that's important is because if you look at what happens during the Spanish Civil War, where there's this intervention on the part of the Nazis and the fascists on the part of Franco's side, but also more importantly at Munich, there's this notion that you can make peace with Mr. Hitler, that he's normal. And he had these normal Olympic Games as part of that. And so you could argue, and I think one would have to be careful about it, more careful than I'm being here, this link between a kind of ambivalent attitude toward international sport and what was in fact passing for international politics at this time.
And so I guess the question, Bob, I want to come to you on first is, to what extent does this history, and it's a very complex, but also in some ways a history where the ideals don't match the reality, and that's not unique, of course, to international sports. But to what extent does that legacy poison or at least reshape the Olympic movement coming into the end of the Cold War and our current world? I think, and I know you've written about this, as has David, the 1980 U.S. boycott of the Olympics after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the 1984 retaliatory boycott by the Soviet Union, and the controversies today over who should participate and who shouldn't. How does this history matter for the way we think about the contemporary Olympics and contemporary
sport? We're all historians, so we know it matters. I hardly know where to begin. It turns out that Olympic sport in the Soviet Union was not that popular with the Soviet peoples, plural. That the only sports that I've written about that were successful spectator sports were basically soccer, ice hockey to a certain extent, and then basketball third. And the other interesting thing about it is that despite the importance of women's sport in the Olympic competition, Soviet men could have cared less, and they did not attend women's sports. And then women themselves did not attend women's sports, with a few exceptional moments. So there is a way in which I would argue that Olympism can find a comfortable fit in its grandiosity, in its pretension, in its formal apoliticism with some of the ways that the Soviets went about organizing sport. And so I would also say that one has to be careful about the World Cup. When the World Cup, and this is true of the Olympics too, starts out, the World Cup starts in 1930, then it's held in Italy in 1934. It's complicated by, first of all, the fact that it's not overwhelmingly popular. The largest arena for that event was held 20,000. Several of the people who are on the Italian team are actually from South America and have Italian roots, but are in fact citizens of Argentina and Chile for the most part. So the links that you're talking about are tricky, and I think they worked in different ways. And so I think what the thing David's already mentioned is that the Soviets come to is that both they and the Olympics share the idea of modernity. And then the other aspect that they share is social improvement. These, you can argue, are liberal concepts, faster, higher, stronger, whatever the order of those are, is something that we can see as part of the liberal democratic striving to make the world better.
Yeah, well, in terms of the Cold War, and again, Bob's written about this, but yeah, it's interesting hearing you raise the boycotts because, and I've got to speak up for my home and native land. The boycott really becomes a weapon in 1976, and
right, correct,
and has a couple of elements to it. First, in terms of Cold War politics, there's a big kerfuffle over whether or not Taiwan can send its own delegation to Montreal. And by that time, the mainland China, Chinese Communist Republic, or Communist China, is recognized by all the Western powers. And so this becomes one of the first test points of the limits of that recognition vis-a-vis Beijing's claims over Taiwan. But the bigger thing is pretty much all the contingents from Africa and South Asia boycott the Olympics to protest the admission of New Zealand and Australia which have continued to maintain sporting relationships with South Africa, despite a Commonwealth ban and other sanctions against South Africa due to apartheid. And this really cuts into the sort of the allure of the Montreal Games. And then, of course, you get Moscow and then Los Angeles in turn. And they're interesting Olympics to compare in the Cold War context, because obviously Moscow had come as a response. The Moscow boycott had come as a response to the Afghan invasion earlier on, and this is one of Carter's last acts. And that doesn't enjoy the support of all the Western powers, of all the NATO powers. They're athletes competing on behalf of Great Britain, as I recall, Bob, and other other NATO states. From our point of view, Moscow is an appropriate disgrace of the Soviet attempt to make themselves a real player, to live up to their aspirations for parity, cultural and military parity with especially the United States. But the Los Angeles Olympics are really, they revel in the boycott mounted by the Warsaw Pact. This is states, partly because it leaves the field clear for an overwhelming American dominance, and a loudly celebrated American dominance, I should add, in the games. And a celebration, given the financing model that Uberoth brought into play. It's a celebration of a certain type of capitalism that's very consonant with the Reagan era. So that the LA committee manages to mobilize every available message in the context of the Cold War to show the superiority of a certain type of capitalist system. Now, that's a denouement that starts to kick in with the Seoul Olympics, where by that time people are willing to admit the use of performance-enhancing substances. The scapegoat, or not scapegoat, the culprit here being Canadian athlete Ben Johnson, who won the 100 meters. But it also lays bare. It also brings to the fore suspicions and actually knowledge behind the scenes that Soviet sports science had been figuring out chemical ways to improve and enhance performance since at least the late 1950s. And it focused on one aspect of the two great counter arguments of Western powers against the Eastern European and Soviet athletes is one, their willingness to go to any extremes to win and to play fast and loose with the rules, and which is connected with the other sphere is the continuing insistence on a model of amateurism that we generally associate with Avery Brundage. The Soviets and their allies flouted these by really having shamateurs, was the phrase at the time, that they had professional athletes who had a veneer of amateurism about them. So by the late 1980s, all of these things have come to the fore. Bob, sorry to hog the floor, and I'll again defer to you.
Well, and Bob, before we get to you, I wanted to sort of move us to what I think is the natural question to follow from this, and the question we, in a sense, always like to close on, which is how can our listeners who care about many of the ideals that you articulated so well, Bob and David, associated with the Olympic movement, international peace and cooperation, amateurism, physical fitness, how, when we're watching the Olympics, how can we try to support those values and de-emphasize all the polluting values that we've talked about here, the nation-state competition, the doping, the cheating? How can we make sure we're a part of the positive and not the negative side? Is that possible, Bob?
Well, to build on what David said, I think the best way to appreciate it and make sense of it is the famous line that Cher has with Nick Cage in that, whatever it is, Moonstruck. Forget about it. Snap out of it. Just enjoy these talented people competing with each other for roughly what is part of a world monoculture of professional athletes of one sort or another to various degrees, depending on the sport, and just enjoy that and understand that Olympism is an ideology that has its roots in some things, including empire, that are fairly dicey and are definitely compromising in view of the concerns that we have in the present world today.
I think I agree entirely. Bob said it very well. Plus, for most fans now, and there's always going to be that national element that you want to take pride in your own country's athletes, but it's really become a festival for a lot of sports in which athletes work really, really hard, thinking of the water sports and track and field and seldom get attention. And this is their chance to shine. And like, you think of Usain Bolt, you think of you think of the American swimmers, you think of other Jackie Joyner-Kersee and the fantastic female athletes we've seen from all over the world. It's a chance to give them their place in the sun and to appreciate how good they are.
And don't forget the most important athlete of the entire Cold War, Wilma Rudolph.
Absolutely.
1960.
Yeah.
So how does the meaning of this moment then change going into 2020, in 2021 actually, at the Tokyo Olympics? How does this meaning change in a time of coronavirus and really the first time since World War II that the Olympics have been canceled or postponed? Bob, why don't you start us off?
You couldn't ask an easy one? I think what you're seeing here is I'm learning about this now because I'm reading a book by a Russian author on the 1980 Olympics and just the sheer enormity of putting on an Olympics and the investment and time and effort, not just by the athletes, but the organizers as well, yep. And the sponsors and the security police and the construction and you name it. There's such a massive investment that it leads to a kind of carelessness, I would argue, on matters of safety, that so much has been put into this effort that the idea of having it come to nothing is so repugnant that they're willing to take these serious risks, not only with the athletes, but with the organizers. I think about the media there, that they're in enormous numbers. I mean, there's 10,000 media there. I was part of it at one point. I worked for CBS during the 1998 Nagano Winter Games, and there's just so many reporters broadcasting, print, running around there, exposing themselves, asking questions, opening mouths, being in mix zones. It's all of a piece.
Yep, you put it perfectly. I agree entirely.
Thank you.
And where do you see us going from here? Is this a new moment in the Olympic story? Is this a new moment in international sports, or are we sort of still stuck in the same cycle?
Well, we're stuck in a really interesting news cycle, right? Because the Winter Olympics are scheduled for early 2022, and they're scheduled for Beijing, whose selection elicited a great deal of consternation. A, because it's not really winter town. B, because of the environmental devastation in which the athletes will have to be competing. But most recently, because the mobilization of international opinion about the Beijing government's treatment of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, and there's already talk. I'm seeing talk up in Canada about the possibility of boycotting as a protest of Beijing's high-handed policy. So we might be entering sort of fugue state, going back to the Cold War in a very new setting.
So let me make a personal point of self-promotion here. Part of our Cold War project that we've hinted at a bit here, our second volume is going to be on the boycott era and it starts, of course, with 76. Truth be told, there's boycotts even before then. And then there are also boycotts that are out of the Olympic context as well. But this has come up, of all people, Mitt Romney had a very interesting opinion piece in the New York Times about how to approach this question of boycotting. And I thought, quite carefully and in a measured way, suggested different ways of protesting without necessarily penalizing the athletes.
Yeah.
So something may happen.
So Zachary, as a young person who watches sports and who's surrounded by others who do you see the Olympics as a positive opportunity to bring out some of these issues, or how do young people that approach these issues?
Well, I think at the very least, the Olympics is in many ways young people's first experience with the world as a whole. It's one of the few areas that young people in an exciting way get to see all the countries of the world and all the peoples of the world lined up and competing. So I think in that sense, it is sort of a positive experience. But I think it's also important to keep these larger political issues in mind. And it's important to have that background when watching the Olympics.
Right. And you have a kind of absurdist view of it, at least as your poem indicated, right?
Right. It's a very strange event.
Bob and David, as your last words and thoughts, how do you personally view the Olympics? What will you be thinking as you're watching the Olympics this year?
Can I quote Zach?
You may.
Warts and sports.
Warts and sports. David?
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting looking at sort of the institutional machinations and the commercial element that's going on that actually underwrites the whole operation. But the actual competition is always exciting, and can't help enjoying it.
I agree 100%. I find myself intellectually uncomfortable, but emotionally caught up in it nonetheless. And I think one of the points of our podcast week in and week out is that democracy is not about a set of static principles and static behaviors. It's about a constant adjustment to a variety of political, social, and economic pressures. And in some ways, the Olympics are a kaleidoscope for that. And we all benefit from watching and thinking rigorously as we're watching and enjoying. And David and Bob, you have given us so much background and quite frankly, so much knowledge that we can bring to our watching to enjoy it more and think more critically about what we're seeing. So thank you both, Bob and David, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeremy. It was fun.
This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. And I encourage everyone to find Bob and David's work and read it. We'll have citations on the website as always. And Zachary, thank you for your humor and ironic disposition today toward the Olympics. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners. Thank you for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini. Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.